All right, welcome back, everyone. In part two of our lecture, we're going to talk about getting an instance from a view. We're going to talk about testing API endpoints. We'll be diving into how fixtures will be utilized to formulate our database within each test suite. We'll then talk about how the get views by name would work within the test suite. And then we'll go back to clean up a little bit of our test suite by utilizing the setup method and organizing everything within the test directory. Finally, we'll cover URL converters. You'll notice that in our curriculum, this is backwards. URL converters come first, but because we have our assessment coming up, I believe we should probably emphasize testing over the rest of the material, since that's going to be the most vital information for everybody here. So let's go ahead and dive into it. So getting an instance. We can send Django URL parameters where we have integers and string. We saw that demonstration yesterday. And we can identify that by seeing the arrow brackets, specifying what data type we're grabbing, and then specifying the parameter name. Here we can see that we have localhost post @/1. This is going to receive the ID of 1. So here we can go ahead and do select from post where primary key is equal to 1. So that's how the data trickles down, right? It's sent through the URL parameter. It's being given as an argument to our method of get, and then we're sending it within our query to the database. All right, does anyone have any questions about that? Awesome. Now, here's where it starts breaking down URL parameters. But before we start talking about any of this, let's dive into some information. Let me just double check the slide deck here. Okay, so testing, let's cover this really quick. So just like models, there's imperative that we test our API endpoints by mocking or pinging their behavior. It may seem like an extra unnecessary work, but as your project grows and becomes more complex, running unit tests will give us the extra layer of security to ensure we didn't break anything in our application. All right, we'll come back and talk about URL converters here shortly. Awesome. So we've already seen URL parameters yesterday. We can kind of identify everything that's going on within those parameters. Let's talk about the ability to be able to retrieve a Pokemon and be able to retrieve a move. Well, I can come to my move app, take over the URLs. Everything is prepended by this information. I can create a new URL pattern that is meant to take the input of an ID. So for example, I should be able to grab the input of the next Pokemon. So here I can say path, integer ID, and then close it with a slash. And this should tab to a Pokemon as view. This will be imported from my views file to specify a Pokemon. Right? Again, all of my URLs inside of my Pokemon app are prepended by HTTP localhost API/v1/Pokemon. At an empty path, it will trigger my all Pokemon. But when I have an argument following it, it's going to trigger line 9 for Pokemon as view. So now we can go to a Pokemon or come over to our views file and build that class. It's a class, a Pokemon, takes in an API view. We have our get method that should receive self for the class itself, the request that's being sent in by the browser, and finally, the parameter is coming in from my URL pattern. Just like before, those two have to match. All right. So anything coming in from my URL's parameter, in this case, I named it ID. It has to be the same exact writing when I'm describing it inside of my method. All right. So now I can move forward and actually start coding this out. we can grab a Pokemon, say the selected Pokemon is equal to Pokemon dot objects dot get, where ID is equal to ID. Can then serialize the Pokemon by passing it to the Pokemon serializer. And then we can return a response that has serialized Pokemon dot data with the status of HTTP 200 OK. All right. So this is for grabbing a Pokemon. Awesome. Let's say I wanted to grab Charizard, since Charizard has a couple of moves. I would just pass in the ID of 2, since that is the ID for Charizard. So I'll say Pokemon /2 / we can see that that crashes. That's because my server isn't running. So let's go ahead and run Python -py run server here. Looks like we have a couple of errors. Let's see what's going on. Oh, excuse me, there is no errors. All right. And for the Pokemon /2, we receive an object that's describing Charizard and Charizard only. All right. Does anyone have any questions over how we implemented this a Pokemon view? Okay, let's go ahead and review by doing the same thing for a move or a move application. I'm going to come over to the move app, open up URLs and open up views, since those are the two files that I'll need. In urls.py, I know that I'm going to need an a move view. Here I'm going to specify the path, where maybe I want to grab moves by their name. So I can say, hey, this is going to be a string parameter that comes in from name. And this will utilize the a move as view. Okay, great. Well, now I can come over to views, generate my class of a move, which should inherit from API view. It should have a get method, which comes in with self and request, where the move or selected move, and I apologize, we also need name here, should be equal to move dot objects dot get, where move, or excuse me, name is equal to name dot title. All right, now we could just serialize it. And return a response where we have our serialized move dot data with the status of HTTP 200 OK. All right, so let's come back over here, check out our moves. Here we have Psychic, Thunder, Fire Wheel, and Steel Wing. So if I could come over and just look up Thunder, oh, there I get Thunder coming back. If I wanted to look up something like Fire Wheel, I could look it up as such. So fire, and then percentage sign 20, I believe, and then it's wheel. And there we get fire wheel. This percentage sign 20 is just supposed to represent a space within your URL patterns. It's not necessarily something for us to annotate or that you need to memorize. It's kind of just additional good to know information. So that way we could grab our fire wheel. All right. Any questions on how we can build a move or a Pokemon view, both of which would grab from the URL parameters, select one specific instance from the database, serialize, and return the serialized data as a response? Let's hear it, Tom.
Just to confirm, if we wanted to grab multiple moves, just not all the moves, like say maybe two, would we need to specify the ability to do that, such as like two variables there, or could we do separation via like comma, like some of the other API calls we've been doing?
To grab two instances?
Yes,
Interesting. I'm gonna need you to show me an example. If you could send me some sort of URL pattern or a link that I can check out, because I don't think I've ever seen a API that would allow me to retrieve multiple more than one instance at a time, unless I'm filtering and or just grabbing all, right?
yeah. Typically, it's with a key character with the ampersand, and then it would be like move equal fire wheel ampersand move equal uh another move, and then it would return like both of those moves.
Got it. That's another way of, yeah, I know what you're talking about now. I apologize. So what you're talking about is sending queries through the query parameter, where essentially there would be something like firewheel, or maybe there would be something like that says moves, and then it would have a question mark is equal, and then we could say move equal um thunder, and um, name is equal to, etc., right? So something along those
Yeah,
lines.
exactly.
Got it. So what we're talking about here is going to be the filtering process. That's not part of like a modern RESTful API convention. So, there is a way to implement it. We're not going to cover it inside of Code Platoon, but there is a way that you can implement that within your views. Does that answer
Gotcha.
your question, Tom?
Yes, thanks.
Of course. All right. So now we have our A moves, we have our A Pokemon information, but now that I know all this information exists and that I can grab this information, I probably want to ensure that it's not going to break at any point. All right, so I want to make sure that I have some sort of tests that will always um, grab this data and ensure that this data stays persistent whenever I'm developing my application. So how can I do that? Well, originally we had written all of our tests inside of this Pokemon app in the test file. But now that I have multiple apps, I may want to change this to take care of models and views, kind of isolate my testing. Well, I would do this as such. I would make a directory named tests. And within this directory, I would make a directory named fixtures that would hold all of my fixture data. I would make a file named test models.py that would hold all of my model testing, and I would make a test views.py that would handle all of my view testing. So let's take a look at tests right now. Currently, I already have some tests for my Pokemon app that were meant for my model, so I'm just going to go ahead and grab those. So here's my test models. I'm going to paste them in there. And for now, let's just make sure that this works, right? Because I will, now that I've moved some things around, I probably want to make sure that everything is working properly. So I'm going to run Python manage py test, and then my command changes a little bit here because I want to specify the location of the test. Well, in this case, I want to look at tests.test models. Notice that I'm specifying the path through dot notation. And let's see. Couldn't import. Oh, I'm not within my Django Python environment, so that makes sense. Let me go ahead and change that here. So Python manage py test test models. All right. And there it runs a couple of tests. It's telling me that it looks like it's having some issues. One of them passed. So ensure this value is greater than or equal to 1. I wonder which value we're talking about here. So it looks like we're talking about proper input, and I'm actually passing in improper input. So let me go ahead and fix my test really quick. And there you go. Both of my tests are passing. So I'm able to see what my tests are being isolated, and anything regarding my models will be placed inside of this test models file. Well, now let's talk about testing our views. So for testing my views, everything in here is going to look somewhat similar to what we've seen before. I can say from Django.test, I want to import test case. And I can also specify, let's start off there and then we'll move slowly as we continue. From there, I can create my class of test, or yeah, let's do test views, where I can inherit from test case. And I can write my very first test. So in here, the test that I'm going to have is going to be test 01 get all Pokemon, which is going to take in self. Now, when I go to get all Pokemon, I'm going to need something to send a request. As of right now, the way I'm testing this out is by manually going to each independent endpoint and pinging the URL. Well, now I need something to mimic the client. So not only am I going to import test case, I'm going to import client. And I'm going to make an instance of said client. So this is supposed to mimic a user pinging URL. Now, again, it's supposed to mimic a user pinging the URL. So how does that even work? How am I supposed to ping the URL through this user? Well, this should look somewhat familiar at this point. We should have a response, and this should be kind of like a shout out back to what we've seen inside of React, right? Where we have response is equal to axios.get URL pattern, right? Well, here we have response where the client is sending a GET request to a specific URL pattern. Well, the question is, how is the client supposed to ping the URL? Because as of right now, my server isn't running, all right? It's not an end-to-end test suite. This is still a unit test. So I shouldn't have to have my server running or have a live version of my server up and running in order to be able to execute this test. So there's got to be a way programmatically that I can resolve these different requests. Well, we do that through the reverse method. So now I can specify from Django.urls, I want to import reverse. Well, what does the reverse method do? Here I can say reverse. And in this reverse method, I would pass in the information as to the name of the endpoint that I want to ping. Well, let's say that the name that I want to ping is my all Pokemon view. Well, how does that work? Let's take a look at my different URL parameters that are available. I'm going to come over to my Pokemon app and take a look at URLs. And actually, let me go ahead and do this number to give us a little bit more real estate. All right. So I'm saying, hey, I want to send this client to send a GET request to the URL parameter that matches all Pokemon. And if I hover over this, we can see that one of the requirements that it's looking for here is the view name. Well, I never provided a name to any of my patterns. So I just need to simply add that parameter. I need to say, hey, the name here will be of all Pokemon. And that's where the dots get connected. All right, so my client will send a GET request to the URL endpoint that has a name of all Pokemon. Here is the name of all Pokemon. It will trigger the all Pokemon as view and then simply return that response. So we can go to all Pokemon and this response value, this return, is what gets stored within the response. Let's actually take a look at the response here. And this should address a question that you had earlier. I believe Tom made the question earlier. So let's run Python, manage py, tests, where I want to test my test views file. Okay, so it looks like my test views file went through. It ran and executed. My terminal's kind of glitching out here, so let me go ahead and execute this again. There you go. And we can see my print statement where I have a response with status code 200. And I can see that it's returning application JSON. It was successful because I never told it to fail. Okay, well, let's take a look at something like response headers. All right, if I execute this, I still get a response headers. Well, now, if I try to look at the response body, response.body is actually returning an error. If I try to do something like response.data, that would also return an error. All right, so here, oh, actually, it's showing us data. And then again, this should answer your question from earlier, Tom, where you were asking about Axios, how when the response came back, we were handling it with .data. That's exactly what we're doing here. Right, so this is a server communication, server to server. I'm still grabbing it through response.data. All right, so now I have response.data. That gives me my body of my response. I could say data is equal to response.data. But let's take a look at this again. When I execute this information, and let me go ahead and print data. I apologize, everybody, I missed that. When I execute this test is coming up empty. Well, let's go ahead and read as to what happens when I execute the command python manage test. In step one, it tells me, hey, I found a test. Awesome. So I was able to identify the test that I had written. But if we take a look at step two, it says creating test database for alias default. All right. Well, what could this mean? What does that specific line of code possibly mean? Well, what that's telling us is that it's actually creating another separate database. What that's a mirror of what our current database looks like. All right, and it's doing this utilizing SQLite. Now, this test database doesn't have any data inside of it, right? And I never created any of these endpoints. And that's why our response is currently an empty list. Because when I go to serialize all of my Pokemon, well, my query of Pokemon.objects.all returns an empty query. So I need a way to essentially rebuild my database every time the test is executed. Because if we come down here, we can also see that upon the test being completed, it goes into destroying the database that it utilizes for testing. Well, how can we do that? Well, starting off with Pokemon, I can say Python manage.py dump data. I can specify that the data I want to dump will be from Pokemon app dot Pokemon. I want to dump it with an indent of 2. And the location I want to dump it in will be inside of tests, fixtures, and I'll say Pokemon test fixture dot JSON. All right, I execute that command, and if I open up fixtures, I now have the Pokemon test fixture. It gives me all this information. Well, let's see what happens when I plug this in. Or even better, how do we plug it in? The test case class is actually going to be looking for a class-based attribute named fixtures. And within this fixtures list, we can specify the location of the fixtures that we want to utilize. For example, here I can say within this directory, inside of fixtures, you'll be able to find the Pokemon test fixture. Let's go ahead and execute this test suite now. All right, it's telling me no fixture named Pokemon text fixture found. Okay, interesting. So it ran into an error. Let me make sure that's what I named it. I think it looks a little different. Let me go ahead and run this. Okay, it's still unable to find it. Let's see if we can run it this way. Interesting. I'm having some trouble being able to recognize this. Let me see if it can recognize the data from yesterday. Okay, so it looks like it's only able to recognize it if it's able to find it within the appropriate app for the fixture data. So it has to be within one of the applications. So I'm just going to simply grab this fixture here, come up, and drop it inside of this app. And now I have my Pokemon test fixture. Great. So now I can go back into specifying that. So Pokemon test fixture. Let's go ahead and execute this command. And let's see. All right, so now we're running into an error. And the reason why we're running into an error is because it's saying, hey, we have a many connection here with the Move app. But the Move app currently doesn't hold anything within the data. So we also have to create a fixture for the Move app. Currently, Move apps doesn't have any fixtures. So let's make a directory in there. Move app fixtures. And let's run the same command for dumping data. And here we do move app dot move indent 2, and we want to drop it inside of move app fixtures move test fixture dot JSON. All right, let's take a look at my fixtures. Here we go. We have my move test fixture. Let's bring that in by specifying move test fixture dot JSON. And now let's run the command for testing. Now when we test, my data reflects what shows up in the browser when I'm sending this request, right? So this new database that gets created needs a way to mimic the current state of the database. And we do that by providing fixtures. All right. Any questions up to this point? Actually, let me do a quick recap before we do any questions. So again, we import test, client, and reverse. Here we have a method named, which would be a test for getting all Pokemon. We create a client that will be interacting with our API. Our client sends a request to the view matching the name of all Pokemon. We can go to the URLs, and here we can see the all Pokemon label is slapped onto the all Pokemon view. We then grab the data from the response and we print the data. All right. Any questions over how to create a test suite for testing your API views so far? Let's hear it, Tom.
Yeah, so you said that the fixture has to exist in the main app first before it will be recognized within the test fixture, correct?
If the fixtures have to exist within the apps themselves, it won't work if I put them inside of this fixtures directory. So I'll have to remove directory from test fixtures. There you go. All right, so just to make sure there's no confusion, all of our fixtures must live within the apps. Does that answer your question, Tom?
Oh, gotcha. Okay. I thought it just had to have an instance and then you could like copy it over and it acted as a pointer, but okay, that makes sense.
Awesome. Any other questions? All right, so now since there aren't any other questions, let me go ahead and send this request one more time. Okay, well, now we just need to make sure that they match, right? We want to make sure that whenever we develop, this response shouldn't change unless I change something within my data. So, how do I do that? The easiest way to do this is by creating an answers inside of tests. This answers file is going to hold all of my different responses. So I could just simply copy and paste this request response. So I'm going to copy it, come over to answers, and I'm just going to make the variable of all Pokemon. And that should hold the following answer. All right, we can see it all come through. It's all in one specific line. I can Command S it to really format it if I really wanted to. Well, now within my test views, I can import. I can say from answer, and let's do dot answer. I want to import all Pokemon. Now I can self dot assert equals where all Pokemon is equal to data. Now I would expect this to be true. So let's go ahead and test it out. We can see that the database is tested. It runs the comparison between them two, and it returns OK. Right, so that's how I can ensure that this request was made appropriately. I could even test the HTTP response. I could write with subtest. I can self.assert equal that response dot status is the same as 200. And there we can see our return being A-OK. If I were to change this to say, I don't know, let's go with 404 not found, and then I test it out, it's going to tell me that the test is going to fail because 200 is not equal to 404 not found. And that's how we completely write a test for grabbing all Pokemon. All right. Does anyone have any questions over how we were able to grab a test or write a test for grabbing all Pokemon? All right, awesome. Let's go ahead and dive a little deeper here. So far, we're able to grab all Pokemon, but I also created a way to be able to grab a Pokemon. Well, let's try to test that out. It should look pretty similar, right? We should have test 02. Hey, I want to grab a Pokemon. It should take in self. Again, we should have a client, which should be equal to an instance of a client. We should have my response be equal to client.get, where we're going to utilize reverse. At some point, we'll have data, which is equal to response.data. Here, we can print the data just so that we can grab it. And we can do the whole subtest and everything else afterwards, right? Everything's going to look pretty similar. But there's a specific difference happening within our response here. So this reverse method is going to check my URLs. Let's come over to urls.py. Currently, I don't have a name, so I need to add it. Name, a Pokemon. That allows me to come back over to test views and add a Pokemon. Let's see what happens when I try to send this request. Well, when I try to send this request, I get a little bit of an error here. I get reverse for a Pokemon with no arguments, found one pattern tried, API slash P1 Pokemon. But look at this. It's telling me we're supposed to receive a regex that allows for digits of 0 through 9. And we're not receiving any arguments here. Well, you may think maybe I could just pass in a Pokemon slash 1 and that would work. But in reality, we have to actually pass in another argument called args. And this stands for arguments. And in this arguments, I could pass in something like, let's say 4, which I believe, oh no, it was 2. That should give me Charizard. Well, now when I run the test, it's able to pass in 2 as the ID parameter and return to me my object representing Charizard. I can come back over to answers, make a Pokemon answer. Here we can see a Pokemon. Come back over to my test, make sure that that gets imported, and then finish out writing my test. So I can say with self.subtest, I want to ensure that response, or excuse me, self.assert equal takes in my response status code to be 200. And then I want to also self.assert equal where data is equal to a Pokemon. Now when I execute this test, I should see 2 tests passing, making sure that all of my data or the responses are being maintained throughout my application. All right, does anyone have any questions over how we wrote a test to grab a Pokemon or wrote a test to grab all Pokemon? Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, can you refresh me on what self.subtest did again? Is it just because we have those two tests?
Right. It's because we have 2 tests. We're essentially saying, hey, this test is going to be executed prior to the parent assertion. So if all of the subtests are successful, then we'll start executing the parent's test.
Oh, gotcha. So it's just an if else for tests.
Essentially,
I
yes.
gotcha. Okay.
Any other questions? All right. Doesn't seem like there are any other questions. So, with that said, we can go ahead and start talking about converters. Now that we know that my application works, I can go ahead and mutate my URL patterns to work with something called named converters. So let's go back to our slide deck here. So when we're talking about URL parameters, currently Django only allows us to do integer or string. But let's say we wanted to do a combination of both, where we would have both integer or string. Or maybe we have a specific data type that we want to receive, something like a Boolean. All right. Well, we want a converter to be able to grab this information. So now we can come back over to Django. Let me actually restructure this here a little bit. And inside of Django, I can generate my own converters. This integer or string is what we know as converters. Let's start off by seeing a Boolean type. Let's say I want to have something like, um, I'll write the function here shortly. Let's say, hey, I want this path to take in a bool and say estimate, or let's call it, oh, wow, I am blanking here. I'm going to do blank. All right. So let's say we're taking in a new data type named bool, and this is going to respond to a lambda function that will say x comma bool. And what it's going to return, I'll say from Django.http. I want to import HTTP response, where I will return an HTTP response stating yes, if Y, else I want HTTP response stating no. And this isn't color coding correctly, which kind of tells me there may be an issue here. Oh, there you go. And this should be if. There you go. All right. So this is what we kind of want to work with here. If I try to run my server now, it should raise a couple of errors. So here we can see that it has some improper URL converter, and it's telling me, hey, this uses an invalid converter named bool. It doesn't exist. Well, I want to create my own. Let's go into the process of creating our converter. Going to make this a class named converter. I'll call it bool converter. And the regex that I'm going to be looking for, which I can specify a regex here, which we know that's what it requires in order to work properly. Or a regex that I need will be something that includes the words of true or false. And so those are the two acceptable patterns that I would like there. True and or false. No other special characters, nothing crazy. All right, so now I can do to Python. These are all methods that are going to be utilized later on, and I'll go into explain this here shortly. Well, we'll take in a value. Well, now I can say that I want to return the evaluated method of value. And within the URL, I can simply return the string of value. All right, so this is how to interact with our URL pattern, and this is how to interact with our Python code. All right, what I want here is going to be a true or false. Eval turns the string of true into the Boolean of true, and the string of false into the Boolean of false. All right, we can go ahead and test that out if we would like. Let me do Python here. And here I can do eval, where we pass in true. You can see that returns true. We can run eval and pass in false, and you can see that returns false. So that's what I want to return to my Python code. Well, now I created this class, but it's not a converter just yet. It doesn't actually interact with anything inside of my URL patterns. And it won't interact with anything inside of my URL patterns until I register it. And I can register this from Django URLs. I can say register converter. Now my register converter function will take in the converter object that I created, which would be my bool converter. And it's going to ask for the name. And the name that I want to utilize will be bool. Now, if we come over here to my server, I'm going to crash my server and then run it again. Now my server is running perfectly fine. All right, let's test this out. Let's make sure that this worked. All right, so here's my Pokemon API. I'm currently about to send in a request to /Pokemon. Everything there still works. I can send a request to 1. That there still works. And if I send a request to, let's say, true, well, now I'm getting an error. This is from Lambda. Got an unexpected keyword argument named blank. It looks like Lambda wasn't able to process this the way I wanted to. So I'm just going to create it as a function. Let's do bool view. This is going to take in request, comma, blank. And then let me do this portion here. Where it's simply going to return the following. Oh, and this is supposed to be if blank. So maybe that was the issue. Let me see here before I change everything else. Let me go ahead and refresh it. Okay, yeah, so that was the issue. It wasn't anything else. I just named it improperly. So now we can see yes. If I go ahead and change this to false, well, now we would see no, right? So I needed a separate data type, either they're integer or string. In this case, I wanted to receive a Boolean value. This register converter needs a class because this class needs to hold a regex. That regex is what identifies the URL pattern. So the URL pattern, whenever we pass integers, the regex would look something like, hey, well, integer regex is something like 0 through 9. And there may be one or more instances. So we can do plus. right? Whereas a string regex, excuse me, would be something like, hey, we might want to accept A through Z along with A through Z, and likely a couple of spaces as well. And we may have one or more instances. All right. So this would be the string regex. This would be the integer regex. Both of those available when I utilize the appropriate converter. In 2 Python, our integer would return the integer type of the value that's being passed in. In this case, we're passing back the Boolean type of this value. In 2 URL, it will always be a string. And that's how we can actually write our own converters to receive other types other than strings or integers. Does anyone have any questions over how to write your own converters? Let's hear it, Tom.
So I see that we're converting it to Pythonic code and string for URL. But can you point out where each one is being used?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I go ahead and send my request, this top portion that's actually able to register of Pokemon slash false, this is a representation of this to URL method, right? And this to URL method is working within the inside of Django. We're not able to see exactly when it's being executed, but basically when Django is compiling all of the URLs and the different URL parameters to recognize, this is when the utilize is being when this method is being utilized. So I guess a finer line to take a look at there would be here in line 24, right? That's where the toString method is being utilized. Now this toPython method, that's the logic that gets spit out into Python. So for example, here, when I grab blank, blank gets passed in as a parameter, and the parameter that gets passed in is what comes back from toPython. So this true or false, the actual Boolean type, not just the string of true or false, is what gets passed into blank and gets utilized within the logic of the view. Does that answer your question, Tom? All right, awesome. Any other questions? Okay, awesome. If there aren't any other questions today, we were able to achieve our end state where we created a Django application that leverages a class-based view through Django REST Framework's API view to generate JSON responses for both Pokemon and move models. We covered all of our highlights, which is the naming convention for URL endpoints, how to connect URLs to API views, constructing class-based views, and how to read tests for resolving URL endpoints. In part one, we covered what are API views, URL naming conventions, function-based views versus class-based views. In part two, we talked about getting an instance and how to generate a view that would be dedicated for only one specific object. We also talked about testing for API endpoints. And then finally, we talked about custom URL converters. At this point, does anyone have any questions over any of the material that was delivered during this lecture? Let's hear, Sam.
Yeah, what exactly is the point or value of the URL converters?
Yeah, so points of value of the URL converters is essentially just to be able to accept different arguments that are coming in without having to write the logic repetitively within API views. So for example, let's say that I wanted to grab all Pokemon that are captured, right? Well, currently in my URLs, I can grab all Pokemon. I can grab all Pokemon with some sort of integer. But here, when I do bool blank, maybe in my API documentation, I'm specifying, hey, make sure you pass in this information or the whether they're captured or not. All right, so we could change this to be captured. And actually, we have some time to kill, so I can actually write this all out. Right, I can come over to my API views and I can make a filtering function. So I can make a, hey, this is a class of filter Pokemon. Whoa. That takes in an API view. It's going to receive get requests, where we're going to take in request and captured. And I just want to grab all of the Pokemon. So Pokemon is equal to Pokemon.objects.filter, where captured is equal to captured, right? Because we know that's going to be a Boolean variable. And now I could return a response where my response is essentially going to be my Pokemon serializer that takes in Pokemon.data. And my status will be of HTTP 200 OK. All right, so here it's able to filter the Pokemon by the captured argument that I'm passing in, whether it's going to be true or false, rather than me trying to convert it within the view. I know that it's only accepting a Boolean variable already. So now I can just bring in my, hey, I want to grab my filter Pokemon API view. I could change this whole Lambda function, bring in filter Pokemon as view, and then I could send my requests. All right, so currently I'm going to grab all the Pokemon that are false. Let's see here. Query set object has no attribute moves. I have no idea where this is coming from. Okay, so this is an error that's coming up from one of my serializers, but I'm not sure I'm quite understanding why this error is coming up. I don't want to take us through a whole debugging portion here. Let me go ahead and can see if I could get this working if I send true. Okay, so both of these are returning the same query set issue. Let me see what's going on here. So instance that moves up off and the move serializer. Query set object has no attribute moves. Okay. Did you mean model? All right. Let me open up my serializers. So it looks like this is what's raising the issue here when I'm trying to serialize the information and I'm passing it into the moves.all. It looks like the moment I utilize filter, it's not able to recognize this information. I see a hand up from Tom. Go ahead, Tom.
I was just going to ask, would it still be able to recognize a bool value since we deleted the lambda function that basically defines our bool?
So it's still able to recognize the Boolean value. So here I can go ahead and print captured, and I could actually print the type as well. So type of captured. Let me run this. And here I can show you as soon as I find my print statements. Here you go. So here's the type. So here we see true and class of bool. So everything's still working there, right? What's actually converting this is the converter, not that lambda function. All right. So the issue is just coming in from my serializer. I would have to write a separate serializer, and that might be a little bit too far into scope. Let me see what time it is. We could do this. We could do this. All right, so here's my Pokemon read. Let me come back over to my views. This is all additional information, everyone, so it's not necessarily something that is going to make or break us. What's the issue now? Original query set object text has interesting. Oh, crud. I just realized what the issue was. It was not a serializer issue. I forgot to pass in many equals true. All right. Okay, so here's my Pokemon serializer. Many is equal to true. I refresh. Okay, that one didn't work. Let me try the read one. I'm passing it in the wrong spot. There you go. So now I'm able to change it to where all of the ones that are captured are being rendered. I apologize, everyone. It's because I wasn't passing that many equals true. Let me pass in our original serializer. This should also still work. There you go. So our original serializer is still working. There was no need at all for an additional serializer. So let me delete that so it's not in our notes and it doesn't confuse anything. All right. The issue again was that I was not passing in many equals true. So now I could change this to be false, and then it would bring in any Pokemon that is not captured that's currently in my database. It looks like all of the Pokemon that are in my database are captured. So there I can see 1, 3, 4, and 2. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, all of which have been captured. If I wanted to change one of them, I could, and we'll see how to do that later on with a put request. But to answer your question, Sam, is to save me the trouble of having to convert information. Now there's a standard, right? The user, whenever I give them my API documentation, they know that if they send a Boolean value, a filtering process will happen, and only the filtered Pokemon that match the result that they're looking for would be rendered to them. I hope that answered your question, Sam.
Yeah, I did. Thank you.
Uh, of course. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, can you please go back to where you created your converter?
Absolutely. So this is where the converter is being registered. This is the creation of the class, and this is where the converter is registered.
So, can you remind me again what that lambda function we deleted was doing again?
That Lambda function was just mimicking an API view to be able to return HTTP response.
Got okay, gotcha.
Of course. All right. Any other questions? All right. Let me go ahead and stop our recording here.